examples of entrepreneurs and projects of social innovation. And if are you ready, Adam, to share with you? Have been traveling all over the world looking at examples.
No.
No? You know, but I've been told you know about examples all over the world.
Because I'm sure you're very aware of this fact that this is now a new wave of bottom-up innovation and bottom-up construction of new types of entrepreneurial models, etc., that has been diffused basically all across the world, starting somewhere in the United States and the UK about 10 to 20 years ago, but is now kind of equally prevalent and equally powerful in Asia. I was recently back from Korea, and also a trip to Singapore, where there's co-working spaces are proliferating everywhere, social enterprises are booming, etc., etc. And if you take a closer look at what's happened in Hong Kong in the last couple of months, the Occupy Hong Kong movement is actually very, very closely related to what you could call the revolt of the Asian creative classes. That is a new generation of people who have grown up with access to the internet, but also access to these new ideas and new conceptions about how to change the world, how to create social change from the bottom up, etc., etc. Latin America, Africa are also realities when this is growing. And there's not much point for me talking about that now, because I'm sure a quick surf on the internet will give you all the necessary information about different projects and different details. I just wanted to put this in a bit more of a context and related to social conflict, which is something that you don't tend to talk very much about in relation to the collaborative economy, because most people who are proponents of the collaborative economy, of social innovation and co-working, etc., tend to have a very non-conflictual and pacific agenda. It is as if you could just simply socially innovate around problems and contradictions without there having to be any necessary confrontation or conflict around this. Okay. As you know, there is an emergent reality, we could call it collaborative economy, which is a sort of a bad term, because every type of economic practice is, of course, collaborative to some extent. But maybe what you have here is a form of collaboration which is not principally organized by the twin classic imperatives of market and bureaucratic power, which used to be the idea, the things that were sort of supposed to guide value creation in the industrial model. And it has a number of different features to it that I'm sure you're all aware about, of peer production, co-working spaces, makers, open design, collaborative manufacturing, collaborative rurality. It's a new thing that's emerging, new types of new rural economy based on knowledge sharing, open seed banks, open technologies, sharing economy-like systems for food distribution. It's growing very quickly in Italy, particularly in the south. It's also been growing very quickly in parts of Asia, like Thailand and China, etc. And this is a new economic paradigm in the sense that it's a way of creating value that's based on the use of common resources, and where the main measure of value isn't really time or access to machinery or things like that, but it's more how good you are at using these common resources. It's sort of an idea of virtuosity as the source of value. And oh god, this is really bad spelling, but I wrote this on the train, so I hope you don't. Anyway, the collaborative economy, you can see this as a new way of organizing knowledge work. Knowledge work is something that's been around for a long time. Usually you used to think about knowledge workers as unorganized, as completely at the mercy of big corporations, big organizations, as a sort of a mass of isolated, atomized, white-collar professionals without either individuality or direction. In the last 20 years, knowledge workers have been kicked out of the organizations that gave them lifetime security, and now they've become precarious, but equally isolated and without any sort of collective interest. But probably the collaborative economy that's emerging right now, co-working spaces are one aspect of that, is part of a process whereby this knowledge work organizes itself and acquires some sort of collective identity. Maybe you can even talk about the emergence of a knowledge working class, right, in some way. Some sort of a social group that has a conception of their own identity and also a conception of their own agenda, what it is that they want to do. Of course, this emergence of a collaborative economy happens within an industrial corporate system which is in terminal decline. Right? Just to bring up a couple of aspects, it's a system that's becoming ever more poor. This is the average growth rate of the 20 OECD countries from 1972 to 2010, and you can see that it's quite quickly dipping into below zero on average. And of course, this is particularly pronounced in Italy, where we've had negative growth for the last 10 years in real terms. Of course, Asian countries and the so-called BRIC economies are exceptions, but they're also slowing down, and there's a lot of indicators to suggest that their growth is not going to be sustainable within the present model. It's a system that is ever more unequal. This is the Gini coefficient of the OECD average. I'm sure you know what the Gini coefficient is. The Gini coefficient is a measure of income inequality. And you have the higher Gini coefficient, the higher income inequality, and as you can see, if you take a departure in 1985, there's been a massive shift, increase in income inequality in the OECD average, to the point that today income inequality in countries like the US and the UK are back at levels in the late 19th century. That is, back at levels that were before the whole construction of the welfare state and everything else that sort of were integral to this system. And it's a system that's ever more indebted, as you can see. This is the growth of different types of debt in the US sector from the 1970s to 2011. So of course, what you have is a sort of a fundamental contradiction between, on the one hand, a new system that seems to promise a number of new and innovative ways to address, not only address social problems, but actually create value, economic growth, jobs, etc. And an old system which is ever less able to do that, and which is ever more locked into a process of self-reinforcing terminal decline. Right? So, and of course this is nothing new. These are very similar to things that have happened in the past, when you had the emergence of a capitalist mercantile economy within a feudal framework sometime in the 16th, 17th century. The scenario was quite similar, right? And of course incredibly conflictual. So, this type of contradiction, is it going to be peaceful? Is it going to be collaborative? Or are there going to be conflicts? I think there are a number of very important conflicts. First of all, people who are engaged in the collaborative economy have very little job security and have very little income, generally. We're now doing studies of co-working spaces in Milano, and people who work in co-working spaces in Milano, on average, make about 700-800 euros a month, which of course is much less than what is necessary to live in Milano, and it's quite obvious that co-workers in a lot of the collaborative economy are people who are being sustained by their families, like most of the creative economy in large Italian cities right now. So there is sort of a welfare going on. In Italy it's a family welfare. In Northern Europe it's to a large extent supported by state welfare. In the US and UK it is, and in Hong Kong it's to a large extent exported by low-wage jobs in the service sector. That is, you can be a barista at Starbucks during the day and a social innovator during the night. And this is a very frequent condition. Of course, this is not in any way functional, and it's not in any way conducive to the efficiency of the sector. So very probably you will see a number of new conflicts around the redistribution of resources and the redistribution of welfare in ways that are functional in relation to these new modes of operation that you find in the collaborative economy. In fact, there are already in Italy a couple of attempts in that direction. There were some people in Rome, for example, a couple of years ago called Quinto Stato, that started talking about new forms of welfare distribution and new taxation systems, etc. And that's a conflict that I think is going to be ever more pronounced as long as the collaborative economy becomes more important and more incisive. Of course, another question which is incredibly important is the management of common goods, because since this is an economy that essentially builds on common resources, ways in which common resources can be managed is incredibly important. Partly, of course, this has to do with things like intellectual property rights, but to a large extent it also has to do with things like access to information, city space, access to working places, etc., etc. Finally, of course, I think the most common, the most important conflict that's going to arise in the next decades is related to the access to financial capital. Because, of course, the whole collaborative economy is a very cash-starved sector. There's a lot of good ideas, but there's very little money running around. At the same time, there are historically unprecedented amounts of money floating around on financial markets. 10 years of quantitative easing has made capital cheaper than it's ever been and access to liquidity easier than it's ever been. It's only that that money is not being invested in the social sector. It's generally circles around in self-referential networks of more or less complicated derivative instruments, etc. And so in a sense, just like the French court in the 1780s was entirely blind to the actual needs of society around it, you now have a distant financial nobility, which in a sense advises the masses to eat cake if they don't have bread, in a sense, or at least are entirely sort of insensitive to the actual needs for resources and for capital in an emerging social innovation sector. And this is something that is going to become ever more acute, I think, as social innovation develops and becomes something more important than just a sideline activity or some sort of welfare or something like that, when it actually transitions and becomes a key sector of production and growth. So overall, I think that it's if people who are interested in social innovation and the collaborative economy should probably start thinking about what sort of conflicts they need to take in order to make this collaborative economy flourish, and how to prepare themselves for those sorts of conflict, both in terms of social organization, mobilization, political agency, etc., ways that will probably be quite different from established modernist ways of political conflictuality, and we'll probably begin to think about articulating those conflicts around these three areas: welfare, common goods, and access to financial capital. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have had some nice examples, but also a critical point of view on the collaborative economy, warning us that if we succeed to make it big, then we're going to have some battles to win. Are there any questions for Adam at this point in time? Nobody has questions right now? Okay. Then let me put it differently, because it was quite a challenging talk. Do you feel that this first theorem or thesis, that the collaborative economy as we see it now is a nice little bubble? As long as it's marginal, it will happen, but if we want to do the transition, some new stuff needs to happen. Do you agree on this? If you agree on this, put your hand up. If you don't, leave it like that. So who agrees that there's work to be done? That it's, as long as it's marginal, it's okay, but so put your hands if you agree. Okay. Sir, of course, I come with the microphone then.
Not clear. I suppose that you have labor, of course. Anyway, that you are talking about social work. But my question could be, it's about ethic. So, how large have to be, or how small have to be enterprises in order to be ethics in the engagement of or to be co-workers or maybe social workers and so on? Because big enterprises, I'm sure that they are full of money, and so and the other could be only ethics. You don't mention ethics. What about? And what do you think?
So how about ethics? If these companies grow, what's happening?
Yeah, I just wrote a book called The Ethical Economy, which is all about this, because I'm so tired about that subject now, so I didn't want to talk about that anymore. But I mean, I think there's an interesting potential for combining value and ethics in this, because since it's a sector that essentially works with reputation as the main measure of value, right? If you can rationalize reputation systems, you can find new ways of connecting ethics to economic value in quite interesting ways.